Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for NCEA's Task of Moral Formation webinar. My name is Kate Reich, and I am the organizer for today's event. Before we begin, please know that all of your microphone connections have been muted. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please send those through the question box that appears in your GoToWebinar panel. To ask a question, please use your mouse and click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click Send. The webinar presentation will last 45 to 50 minutes, and any questions that you have asked will be addressed in the remaining time. Later this evening, you will receive an email asking you to complete a brief evaluation about this webinar, as well as information about creating a certificate of attendance. I thank you in advance for providing us with feedback about today's webinar. We will also be sending you another email with instructions on accessing this recorded webinar and presentation files in another business day or two. Now I am very happy to introduce Dr. Lori Dahlhoff, Executive Director of NCEA's Religious Education Department, who wishes to share a few words. Welcome, Lori.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm very excited to be with you today to do the fifth in our series of 6 Tasks of Catechesis webinars. And I'm very, very glad that we have with us today Joseph White, who I've known through his writing for years, and now I've had the pleasure to work with on a number of projects. So join me in welcoming Joseph White to the presentation as well.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Today, what Joseph and I are hoping we'll be able to do with this time is to engage in a learning dialogue. It's really designed to help you describe what the catechetical task of moral formation is really about, and to be able to explain what we mean when we say a well-formed conscience, and we being the church. Also to be able to sketch a bit of what the cognitive and affective indicators of moral formation, moral development look like in practice. And finally, like most of us are educators, to be identified practical ways to address moral formation in the various places where we are called to teach. And so we want to engage, the first place we want to engage is you. Where is the setting that you serve in religious education and catechesis? In a moment, Kate's going to put up a poll that will allow you to respond to this question. So which term describes the primary settings where you serve in Catholic education and catechesis? Is it parish, Catholic school, diocese, other, or multiple settings? So we'll take about 30 seconds, so make your determination and hit submit. Also, to let you know, we want to thank those folks who submitted questions when you registered. It helped Joseph and I shape the outline and the content for this webinar. We'll address some of them specifically at the end, but also many of them will be woven into what we present along the way, particularly the questions around how do you help form folks at different ages. So what are some of the moral development implications, particularly for teenagers? That was a pretty frequent question. And so looking at the polls, it looks like 63% of those gathered are from Catholic schools, some are from parishes, dioceses, multiple settings, as well as other settings. So we hope as we go along today that you will find some help in guiding and working through this important task. So let us do all things as we pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Compassionate God, you created us out of love for relationship with you and one another. As we begin this session, make us mindful of those who give us opportunities to reflect Jesus Christ in how we choose to live. For those closest to us, our family, our friends, our colleagues and students. For teachers and healers. For leaders and authorities. For those among us who are weak or sick. And for each one of us gathered now. May the Holy Spirit open our minds and hearts to listen for your word of challenge and mercy. Amen. So what does this task of moral formation really involve? Well, I want to start with a basic language refresher, because the task itself is trying to achieve two things. In the sense is that these two Greek words come together in proclaiming the gospel and making it a living reality among us. So the first is evangelization, which is around sharing the good news of proclaiming Jesus Christ and the gospel through word and witness of life. And evangelization has three basic aspects. There's evangelization for those who are non-believers, for those who've never heard of Jesus Christ. There is evangelization of those who are new or minimal believers. In the sense that's also for people who are younger, so for those who are teaching students, as well as what we now call the new evangelization, which is for long-time believers, so that we're always proclaiming Christ and the gospel in our lives. And to be able to evangelize, we need to know what the Word of God is. And so that's where catechesis comes in. So catechesis is the education of children, youth, and young people and adults in the faith of the church. So within that, the whole aim of what we do is to bring people in touch, communion, and intimacy with Jesus Christ. So as I said, if evangelization is about sharing the gospel, catechesis, which teaches you the gospel, is a moment in that whole process. And again, there are two types of catechesis. One is initiatory, so when you're first coming to know these teachings, this person of Jesus Christ, and then ongoing. And that catechesis flows on from your whole life. So it's on these two basic words, which are the basis for what we do in catechesis, that we come to this task of moral formation. It's one of 6 tasks, as I mentioned earlier, and what is aimed at is promoting the moral formation in Christ by transmitting both the content of the church's moral teaching as well as their implications for Christian living. And so moral catechesis aims to conform the believer to Christ, to bring about both personal transformation and conversion. And this comes to us from the National Directory for Catechesis, written by the Bishops of the United States. So as you can see, there's 3 very important pieces to this task. One, and most primary, is the conversion to Jesus Christ. It's about walking in his footsteps as a lifelong disciple. It's about a journey of interior transformation, which is witnessed in private and public life. And it also demonstrates the social consequences of the demands of the gospel. So for moral formation in this task is both personal and social. And so I'm ask you, Joseph, what does the church then mean in this task of moral formation when we talk about a well-formed conscience?
Yeah, we hear references in many church documents and in catechetical texts to conscience formation and ensuring that we have a well-formed conscience. And it's important that that people realize that involves several different components. One is knowledge of Catholic teaching on moral issues. So we need to know that the church is here to guide us and help point the way for us, to teach us, and that that we have things that have been handed on through Scripture and through sacred tradition as markers along the way. And so one of those, of course, and one of the most basic ways that we help form children and youth in the faith is through the commandments. Very often we start teaching the 10 Commandments in detail right there before First Reconciliation, and that's at a time when kids really become very rule-oriented anyway and become kind of notorious tattletales because they're really into rules. And so providing for them God's rules for our life is important. The Beatitudes, of course, because these really are principles that Jesus gives us that help us know what it means to really live out disciple of his. Things that should, dispositions that should grow in to do good things than some of the social teaching that how to relate to one another. I'm a signal that I have a slow connection, so I'm not sure what I need to do. Can everybody hear okay? Can you hear me okay, Lori?
Yeah, I can. I'm thinking let's stop with the webcams for a bit and just go with the audio. That might help a little bit with the connection. So it was nice to see everybody. We're going to go just with audio for now.
Okay, and then just to continue about what it means to have a well-formed conscience, one of the most important things is understanding the criteria that the Church gives us for the morality of an act. This is found in the Catechism, and so participants can look there for some more information on this. But there are three basic criteria: the object, the intention, and the circumstances. The object, the Catechism says, is the matter of the act. This is the act itself. Is it objectively good or is it objectively evil? Another way that the Catechism puts it is the good toward which the will deliberately directs itself is the object. So what is the object? Secondly, what is the intention? This is the purpose or the end that's pursued in the action. So a good intention doesn't make an objectively bad action good. So we can't do the wrong thing for the right reason and come out with a moral action. But on the other hand, a bad intention can make an act that would have been good bad because it diminishes the good that's done. It's not done with the right intention. For example, doing some good act towards others just to get attention. Or so that other people will think that we're great people. Finally, the circumstances are the secondary elements, and the circumstances are things like, for example, the consequences of the act, so what actually happens, and as well as just the context within which it occurs. It can't change the moral quality of the act itself, but it could diminish the culpability or responsibility of the actor. For example, if somebody commits a morally wrong act out of fear of death or something like that, that doesn't make it a good thing to do, but it might diminish the responsibility a little bit. So understanding those criteria are important. And finally, the ability to apply moral principles. Knowledge is necessary. We have to know our faith in order to live it. But it's not enough just to know. We really need to be able to put it into practice, to put it in the context of our everyday lives, and to have a heart that's directed towards practicing that and really being disciples of Jesus Christ.
Okay, it looks like Lori has our second poll available. She's going to ask, which force presents the most challenge in your work guiding children and youth to make moral choices? We ask that you choose one. I'm going to host the poll. And let's see, there we go. If you can make your selection and click submit.
And I know you might be tempted to want to choose all of them, but think about which is the one force that's bringing the most challenge to you right now. We'll take about 10 more seconds. All right, let's see where we're at with this. So for many, again, it's across the board, but popular culture and media seem to be the factors that are causing the most challenge, along with then parents, peers, and then followed by parents and others. So if we think about these factors then, what then brings us to looking at what are the cognitive and affective indicators that show up as an influence of some of these things, Joseph? What might we see in learners as they grow and develop?
Well, you know, we do see changes as kids go through the course of development, both in the way that they make moral choices and just in terms of the way they think about various situations. And just by way of refresher here, you may be familiar with Pjs Stages. I think most educators remember something about Piaget. Piaget was an early developmental theorist that talked about the way that kids' quality of thinking changes over time. So he described a pre-operational stage that occurs in the first about 6 or 7 years of life. It's characterized by lots of imaginative thinking, what he called egocentrism, which is the tendency to view the world only through one's own eyes and not really realize that other people have different perspectives. Not a real grasp yet on cause and effect kinds of issues, fact-based knowledge. But then as kids really firmly enter those school-age years, they also enter what Piaget called concrete operational stage of thinking. Here is where thinking really becomes very concrete, very rule-based, that knowledge of cause and effect. And then as kids get older, your learners that are entering their teenage years will hopefully be entering a formal operational period. We still have a lot of concrete thinkers among teenagers and even adults. But this is where it first really becomes possible. Hypothetical reasoning, for example, is a formal operation, much less concrete and more abstract thinking. So that's one thing that we look for in terms of the ability to move from one stage to another in moral reasoning. It also depends on formation in moral principles, and then the ability to use those principles. Do we also have a slide on Kohlberg and Gilligan? I'm sorry, I'm not able to move the slides. Oh, here we go. Okay. Some things that we look for, and these are two theorists who are very popular in the world of human development on this issue, on moral reasoning. And this is more about how decisions are made than it is about quality of decision. So whether the act is moral or immoral, it may be a separate issue than what criteria the learner uses to decide that. But in the pre-conventional stage of reasoning, which roughly corresponds to Piaget's early stage, the pre-operational stage, moral decision making at this stage is really about avoiding punishment and working towards a goal, working towards rewards or being seen as a well-behaved kid, a good girl or a good boy. This is the stage at which when kids do something good, they want to show it to you. See what I did? Because they want to be recognized for it. As kids get a little older, they become more capable of moving into conventional moral reasoning. This is more along the lines of conformity to a system of rules, being approved of by the group, having a sense of order, and you can see how this would correspond with that concrete operational thinking. That's more rule-based kind of thinking. And then as learners get older, especially as they're able to enter a more abstract level of thinking, they're moving into post-conventional reasoning, which is focused more on social contract and individual rights, and then later on an internal sense of universal principles, so being able to be guided by universal principles that one has internalized within them. Now, Kohlberg has his critics, and there are competing theories that have emerged. One is the theory of Carol Gilligan, and hers is interesting in the sense that she gives different criteria for how people make decisions across the process of development, and has an interesting take on it. The first stage is individual survival. This is a focus on the individual and his or her needs. And this stage ends with a transition where the person is becoming more responsible And so that second stage there is the desire to avoid hurting others. Here there's more awareness of others, and this ends also with a transition which balances personal needs with the needs of others. And then the third stage in Gilligan's theory is called the ethic of nonviolent care. There are three principles within this stage. One is the principle that all human beings depend on one another, so it's an interdependence, a communal kind of relationship. Secondly, the principle that the vulnerable deserve extra consideration or preferential consideration. You'll see the connection between this and the Catholic principle of preferential option for the poor. And then the third principle within this ethic of nonviolent care is the need to attend to the context to promote the interests of everyone, to look at what is the common good. So I think Gilligan's theory actually is very compatible with our Catholic way of thinking in terms of growth and conscience formation and how we make these moral decisions.
Joseph, as we were talking and preparing for this webinar, you talked about these levels of moral reasoning as an important way for us to begin to look at learners. Is there a question or some way that you use to help yourself discern where a particular person is at in the sense of their moral reasoning capability?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lori, and you know, one beginning point is kind of looking at what tends to correspond with different ages, and I mentioned that a little bit as we went along. But it's also important to realize and remember that stages of development refer to particular trends in development, and they don't mean that everybody of a certain age is going to be at a certain level. I mean, certainly we've worked with kids that we felt like were very precocious and even already had some of those internalized principles that even if they were in the wrong environment, they would be trying to do the right thing. We've also worked with kids, you know, that you know, learners that are much older that we feel like should be at a level where they can be more responsible to others that are more utilitarian in their perspective. And so it kind of depends on learner to learner, but I think one of the things that we'll observe is when we talk with learners about what motivates them, what their goals are and why, we'll see some indication. You know, for example, people that are motivated by money or by things are probably more in that pre-conventional reasoning that Kohlberg refers to. People that are motivated by wanting to fit in and be a part of the group are in that conventional stage of reasoning. So it gives us some indication, you know, both knowing those stages of maturity as well as knowing the individual and what stages of maturity they manifest.
Thank you, Joseph. And that, for me, it really connects well with what we do with NCEA's assessments. When we look at the two religious education assessment tools that NCEA provides, the assessment for children and youth religious education, or what people often refer to as ACRE, or the Information for Growth Adult Faith Formation survey, really puts these two sets of indicators together, both cognitive, so the reasoning development, as well as the affective, or how folks manifest what they believe. And so within those assessments, much like you talked about, Joseph, there are two basic things that we're looking for in the sense of cognitive development. So one is looking about what is the knowledge of Jesus and the church, as well as for the basis of Christian morality. And then also an importance of a well-formed conscience for decision making. So much like you talked about, Joseph, with what makes an act moral, or how do you determine what's good or wrong. That's a part of development that will look different depending on whether you're at 5th grade or 8th or 9th grade or 11th and 12th grade or an adult, and to know that that's developed over time. And so affectively, in these assessments, as you talked about, it's the relationship. How do folks relate with Jesus Christ? What's the image of God that they present? What are the behaviors that reflect Catholic morality? Can the individual articulate or tell the difference between what the church does or does not teach on a particular aspect, as well as showing signs of social responsibility, particularly care for the poor and vulnerable. So those are basically what the tools are designed to do, is in some ways follow those stages of development and using indicators like those on the screen that help you get a sense for where a particular group of students are and have been influenced by what they've learned to this point. And so that brings us to our third poll. We share like the religious education assessment tools are some things to support you. The different theories around development are there to support you. But where do you find support in your work for forming children, youth, and adults in moral formation and decision making? And this one you can choose all of those that apply. So we'll take about 20 seconds to have you let us know, where do you already find support for formation? Okay, about 5 more seconds. And so one of the strongest one, and it's not surprising, is from the church, then followed by parents and guardians, peers. Gaming is a very distant, or excuse me, media is a distant 20%, and popular culture is 13%. And so, again, knowing that there's a variety of support that you can glean from that, Joseph, what are some of your suggestions for practical ways to address the task of moral formation?
Yeah, so this is where the rubber meets the road, and I think as we get into this discussion, we want to consider a couple of key principles that are going to be our guiding principles when we talk about best practices. First, always important to remember that Christian morality is about more than following rules. It's about following a person, the person of Jesus Christ. So knowledge of moral rules and principles is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough just to know. Following Jesus requires a change of heart, and so it's important that we build into our processes and to our methodologies opportunities for encounter with Jesus Christ. Opportunities to really, on a not just a head level, but on a heart level, really encounter the living Christ and have an opportunity for conversion. Third, it's important to remember that especially older children, or I'm sorry, especially younger children, learn by doing. These concrete learners are going to need to use their senses in order to learn and experience something new. So this also applies as we teach the moral principles of the church as well. And then older children and teens, they really need a vision for who they're called to be. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into some specific age groups here in a second, about what we need to do in order to give them that vision. So we can go on to, here we go. So for preschool and kindergarten children, they need limits and structure. Guidelines that we give them should be supported by positive consequences when behavior is appropriate and logical negative consequences when it's not. Remember, these kids, really, we would expect them to be in that pre-operational stage that corresponds with the pre-conventional stage of moral reasoning. And so it's going to be important for them to see that structure. It's going to be important that the kids that are misbehaving aren't the ones that are having the most fun, or otherwise we're going to have a big problem on our hands. Secondly, it's important to teach our learners that God made them because He loves them, and that He invites them to imitate Him in showing love for one another in concrete ways. And so to think about really practical ways that we can demonstrate our care for one another. Kids this age can learn that God gave them hands to help others, that He gave them voices to praise God and to talk with friends and family, and eyes to see God's beautiful world. And because they're in that egocentric stage of development, relating this and connecting this with the self is very important. They're They're in that stage where right now they're kind of picturing the world as revolving around them, and they'll eventually learn how to take other people's points of view. And then finally, moral catechesis for really young preschool years should also include a focus on learning to forgive and asking for forgiveness. And this is mostly going to be coached by teachers and catechists in those everyday opportunities when somebody hasn't been sharing or when somebody's not been nice to somebody else, really helping them express their feelings to one another, helping them listen to what the other has said, and coaching them through a problem-solving process where we say I'm sorry and we work on the problem together. I think sometimes our temptation, because it's faster, is, when there's a problem between two kids of this age, we just kind of divide them, you sit over there, you sit over there, and give them a 5-minute timeout, and they can come back together when they're ready. But there really is something to be said about coaching kids through social problem solving. That really teaches them, I think, a lot more. And so when it's possible to do that, it's really important. Then moving to elementary school age children. At this age, they're really ready to better understand the commandments as long as we present them on a developmentally appropriate level, right? So they're not going to understand what it means to commit adultery or things like that. But when we present them on a level that kids at this age can understand, they're ready to understand them. Kids this age very often want to know what the rules are in various environments. And so that structure, those rules help give them a sense of security. It's also important when we can to explain the reasons behind the commandments or the reasons behind our rules, how these 10 commandments help us to love God and to love others, because Jesus again said that all of these things relate back to that great commandment. And so it's important for them to understand the 10 commandments within that context. And then finally, the Beatitudes are critically important. But these are more principles, so we can introduce them at this age. But because principles are more hypothetical and more abstract in nature, those things will unfold as those kids get older and really approach the more formal, abstract kind of thinking. Elementary school kids need a message that simultaneously promotes a positive self-image and also continued efforts to work towards holiness and to be virtuous with God's help. As a child psychologist, one of the things that I'm sensitive to is when people worry that if they teach kids about sin and things like that, that this will somehow give them a bad self-esteem and it'll kind of hurt their view about themselves. And I think there certainly are ways to do that where you do damage their view about themselves. But I think ultimately it's a positive message to say, even though we all make bad choices, we were made for more than that. That God actually made us to be loving and to do good things, and that with His help we can do that, that He'll give us that grace and that help. What's much more important when we look at positive outcomes in people, much more important than self-esteem is self-efficacy, this belief that we can really do good if we apply ourselves, that we can do well at whatever we're applying ourselves to. And so we want to focus here on really shoring up that sense of self-efficacy. Secondly, it's important to help learners this age distinguish between mistakes and sins. Sometimes when adults get really upset over accidents or mistakes, kids get confused about that. They think that they've been bad because, they spilled the milk or whatever. It's really important, that adults send a clear message about that and let accidents be accidents as long as there wasn't a sin involved there, like running through the house and then something gets broken when they're not supposed to run. The sin there wasn't breaking whatever got broken. The sin was running through the house and disobeying. So helping them distinguish and understand the difference there. Presenting both good and bad choices or loving and unloving actions in terms of concrete examples that apply to their everyday lives. So what does this mean for them in their everyday life, and how can we connect those commandments to those everyday choices they may face? And then finally, role-playing good choices. One of the things that we know from social psychology is that we are much, much more likely to do things that we actually practice. So it's important, for example, to be able to give kids scenarios like, hey, pretend like we're all on the playground, and you pretend like you're the new kid that nobody knows yet, and you're over here kind of feeling lonely, and these kids that are best friends are playing soccer, and you guys act out what would be a loving thing to do in this situation. So give them that scenario, have them role play the right thing, because we're more likely to do things that we practice. We don't want to role play bad choices. I mean, every once in a while people want to do a couple different scenarios to contrast the good choices with the bad choices. But we don't want to have our learners practice the wrong thing to do. So if we want, by way of contrast, to do something, we can have the teacher, the catechist, role play that part. But really focusing on the good, I think, is going to be what they really need. As our learners get a little older, middle school age learners, in those later elementary school years and as well as in the middle school years, they're moving into a period of more abstract thought. And so here's where they're beginning, hopefully, to internalize standards of behavior, to kind of make up their own mind internally about what they believe and what's a good thing and what's not a good thing. Here's a good time to re-examine the Beatitudes in the context of discipleship and being followers of Jesus, to study the virtues, and as well as discovering and embracing God's plan for their lives. There was a study that was done that was looking at when do kids really begin to think about what kind of adults they'll be and really become very future-oriented. One age where they think about that a lot, when they think about what they're going to do and who they're going to be as adults, is age 17, and that's no big surprise to us because, they're about to turn 18, and traditionally that's when we say they've reached young adulthood. Although I know many of us still think of 18-year-olds as being very young too, more kids than adults, but certainly it's what they're thinking of as that magic age. The other age, though, may surprise you. The other age when kids really think a lot about what kind of adults they'll be is age 11. And there's some good reasons for that. One is just the physical maturity that happens around that age really leads kids to really understand, hey, I'm not going to be a little kid forever. I'm growing into an older person, into a grown person. And what kind of grown person am I going to be? What kind of adult will I be? And so this is a really important time here at the end of elementary school, at the beginning of middle school, to really begin to focus kids in on who is God calling you to be? What kind of person will you be? And what would help get you on the road to that? There was a great study that you'll see the reference for in the references later, that was done, a cooperative study between the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Waterloo in Canada, that looked at ways to help middle school students in particular avoid risky behaviors as they get older and move into the high school years. And so the risky behavior that they were targeting in the study was risky sexual behavior. And the wisdom at the time kind of was saying in the research literature, and the secular research literature was saying, abstinence education, while it's well-intentioned, just doesn't work. And what Gemin and Fong found in their study was that that actually it can work and can be the best kind of education, but it has to be presented in a certain way. A lot of the abstinence-only approaches focused simply on risks and reasons that they needed to be fearful of engaging in that kind of risky behavior. The problem is young adolescents see themselves as invincible. And so if we tell them, 99 out of 100 kids will meet this terrible end if they do this thing, they'll think that they're going to be the one who gets through that. And so what they found was much more effective was focusing on goals and positive outcomes. What do they want for their future, and what gets them on the road to that, and what leads them away from that? Now, as Catholics, if we're going to adopt that approach, there are a couple of things we can do. We can talk about that in terms of practical issues, but also in terms of spiritually, and what is God calling us to be, and what leads me to be more that person. But what gets me off of that road and leads me in a different direction. So focusing on goals and positive outcomes is very important.
And we did include reference to the study that Joseph mentioned at the end section. So for those of you who want to go back and look at the science that's behind what Joseph was talking about, you can find that in the resource section at the end of the PowerPoint.
Okay, and then moving into high school age learners. Here, there's continued identity development, so some continued focus on who am I, why am I here, what's it all for, all those ultimate questions of life that I think not only does our faith have answers to those questions, but our faith gives good answers to those questions. And so these are really relevant questions for high school age learners, and we want to show them how their faith is relevant to those questions. This can be supported by discussions of vocation. Who is God calling you to be? Very often we ask them what they want to do when they finish school. Who do you want to be? What do you want to do? Less often do we ask them, what do you think God made you for? Who do you think God is calling you to be? I feel like sometimes we're almost afraid to ask that question. And I think it's our tendency to kind of want to take matters into our own hands and not fully trust God. But knowing God's plan for our lives really helps us be as happy as we possibly can be, because the best life we can have, the most fulfilled life we can have, is when we're doing what we're made for. And so sending that message to our high school learners is so important. And then continuing again to focus on goals and desired outcomes rather than fear and negative consequences. Also remembering that at this age some natural questioning and some struggle is typical and is normal and can be healthy. And so this is an age where many learners may be challenging some of the teachings of the church, saying, well, why is that, or I disagree with that. This is part of the process of being able to internalize those standards and make them their own. They're reaching an age where, at least in our culture, they're not going to accept it simply because the older people told them that this was the case anymore. And so they've got to struggle with it a little bit to make it their own. And one way we can help them really make it their own and internalize those values that we want to hand on to them is allowing them the room to question and really knowing that when those hard questions come up, and sometimes they're questions that are hard for us as teachers and catechists to answer as well, that it's okay, to not have the perfect answer right there in the moment. That sometimes we might need to say, you know what, that's a good question, and I can see why you would ask that, and I want to get you the right answer to that. So let's continue to ask that. I'm going to do some research, and I'm going to get back with you on that. Let's keep this conversation open. Letting them know that it's okay to ask those questions, not shutting them down with answers like, well, that's just what the church teaches. Because while that might be true and while that's certainly important, it might not be satisfying for them, and they may not really understand that there are good reasons that the church teaches what she teaches about these moral issues. And so keeping that conversation open, inviting them to continue walking with us, even if they don't fully understand right now where the mind of the church is on those issues, is important.
And I think too, Joseph, that many of the characteristics that we look at for high school age learners are also those that we can apply to working with adults as well, and taking it as continued sophistication and complexity with what's going on for adult formation as well. But this doesn't stop. Moral formation continues through your whole life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and some of those questions and struggles and issues are also things that we encounter in, for example, in an NCEA process where people are hearing or beginning to understand some of this for the first time and making it their own as well.
Well, and for instance, many people they find support in the church. Well, Catechetical Sunday for this year, which is September 20th, the artwork is already released for the theme, which is Safeguarding the Dignity of Every Human Person. And this is an example of the poster that's in Spanish. But even using something like this as a discussion point, it can work for all ages in a sense. But being able to take the real concrete situations of people's lives, of illnesses, of relationships, of all kinds of different ways that we are called to bring about the dignity of every human person becomes opportunities to grow and to form folks. So in summary, from what we began with, the task of moral formation is about promoting moral formation in Christ by transmitting both the content of Christ's moral teaching and their implications for Christian living. So looking for cognitive factors like knowing church teachings such as the commandments or what makes a well-formed conscience are things that we look for over time. And affective indicators of the task include following the moral rules and principles because the person has a relationship with Jesus Christ, that it's conversion of heart, as Joseph said, and that our concrete actions reflect Christian morality. And ultimately, the implication of all of this for our practice is that Christian morality is about more than following rules. It's about following Jesus Christ. It's about forming disciples. And particularly memorable for me was Joseph's question that we're encouraged to ask learners, who is God calling you to be? To have the courage and the confidence to ask that question of learners. And so as we talk about questions, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask now, if you could type them into the box, please do so, and Kate will present those to us as they come in. We also have a few that people submitted beforehand, such as this one. As educators, how do we help parents and families develop their moral compass? Students can't just be instructed at school or parish to have a moral compass, as much of this begins at home. Any thoughts that you have on that, Joseph?
Well, and I agree, and I think that we're living in some challenging times with respect to this because the mind of society in general on many different issues is very different, and people have had a steady, I know one of the challenges that people mentioned as a really major challenge at the beginning was popular culture, and from popular culture people have had a steady dose of competing values in a lot of various ways. Now, there also are some things that support us rather than challenging us in popular culture today, and so the challenges are different depending on the generation that you're living in. But one of the things I think we can do is really focus additional effort on adult faith formation, really help adults understand what the church teaches and why, and give them the space again to chew on that a little bit, to reflect on that a little bit. And have opportunity for conversion of heart, because when they step up as good examples and as leaders in their families, then we see great things happen. And I agree that it's difficult to kind of instruct that at the parish or the school when it's not consistent at home.
Joseph, one of the other questions that had come in was about resources, particularly with teenagers, for helping them discern moral action. Do you know of any cases or resources that you could suggest?
Well, most of the curriculum publishers have some particular curriculum on morality. It's part of the U.S. Bishops' framework for high school, for example. So the publishers that do series on with the topics of the USCCB high school framework will have a section on morality, and some of those offerings are very good. Also, I would look for a teenager-friendly examination of conscience. That's something, doing a frequent examination of conscience is one of the ways that we form our consciences, and sometimes if we're not asking ourselves the right questions, we're not reflecting, then we're missing a lot of what's happening in our lives. And the places where we're doing good that we need to do more, and the places where we're not doing well as well. I'd have to do a little searching to recommend some particular resources, but I'm hoping that giving you some categories of things to look for might be helpful as well.
I really like your suggestion of going back to a regular examination of conscience. I think it does two things. One, like you said, it forms your way of thinking. but it also puts into practice a regular self-reflection. And so it doesn't make the sacrament of penance and reconciliation feel so foreign. It doesn't feel like I'm going back to that early stage of punishment and reward. That part of what that examination becomes is a way of living out your relationship. And so I'm intrigued about what it might be like to use the examination of conscience as a regular way of beginning to look at moral issues. I know Kate said, oh, go ahead, Joseph.
And one thing I would add to that is looking for an examination of conscience that, again, not only just focuses on the don'ts, but also the virtues that we're trying to cultivate, the beatitudes that we're cultivating in our life. So what are we orienting ourselves towards, as well as what we need to be steering away from is important.
No, Kate said there's a question that came in.
Yeah, first of two is, can you speak to Catholic programs for parents regarding education of moral teaching and what the Church teaches and believes for parenting?
Well, there are some great books on parenting out there. Do you want to give me? You want me to give you some specific resources? Can I do that, Lori?
Yes, please do.
One of my very favorites, and it encompasses multiple ages, is called Parenting with Grace. It's by Dr. Greg and Lisa Popchak. Greg Popchak is a Catholic counselor as well, as being very well versed on Catholic moral teaching, and I know the family personally, and they practice what they preach, and that's always very nice to see as well. So I think Parenting with Grace is a great resource for parents. I have a parenting book that came out recently called The Catholic Parent's Toolbox, where I'm also trying to weave in the things that we know about child development with some practical issues that parents encounter. I think that's a helpful combination, to look for those things, in the sense that we've got to find some ways to make it practical. So, sometimes the principles and the teachings out there can be kind of nebulous until the rubber meets the road, and we look for how to apply those. There are some other resources out there for parents, but I think that this is an area where we really need more, and so I would encourage anybody who's working with adolescents that may have some ideas in that direction, some helpful hints for parents, for example. We need our practitioners out there who are working with teens every day to be writing some of this as well. And we've got some great publishers that are ready to take a look at that, and this is certainly a big need.
And just to kind of put another plug in for some of Joseph's other work, he wrote an article for last year's Catechetical Sunday around moral development and notes for new catechists and parents, just to help, I think, families in particular understand that they can't have the same moral expectations of an 8-year-old that they would for a 15-year-old, and what are the consequences of that? What does that mean for you, even how you set up situations for your children or deal with different situations? And there's a link to that in the resource listing at the end, as well as just a small pamphlet called Catholic Parent Know-How on Morality. It's about 10 years old now, but it's also one that I found very helpful in working with parents to begin to own their role in moral formation, in that no matter what they do, they're forming a moral compass. And so instead of being afraid of that, to really ask God to develop that confidence and trust that you do have the ability to help shape someone's way of seeing the world and reflecting that light of Christ that's already in your life.
Lori, I'm glad that you mentioned the confidence, and I think one of the things, I know we have a lot of people on the line who are from schools, and one of the things that schools can do that would be a great service to parents is to host parent meetings where we talk about some of these parenting issues, make it a community discussion, a public square for them where they can be reinforced in the values that they want to hand on to their kids, as well as be able to learn and gain ideas from other parents. very often we're increasingly isolated in our societies, and family units are becoming increasingly isolated. So facilitating that kind of community and that dialogue around parenting issues can be so important.
And NCEA is actually part of a partnership with multiple organizations in a program called Strong Catholic Families, Strong Catholic Youth. And it's really meant for local dioceses to train people in helping families live their best and supporting one another, as you talked about, Joseph, in a society that doesn't naturally bring as much networking in the sense around how to be a Catholic parent. So that's another resource that we do have available. Kate, you said there was a second question.
There is, and it's got a little preface, so hold on for a second. It says, I have been a middle school religious education teacher for the last 6 years. I have noticed that a growing number of students think that an unmarried man and a woman living together is, quote, not a big deal. I was just wondering if you have any suggestions for how to address this. I've repeated again and again the Church's view on this, but I'm looking for new suggestions or approaches that you might have.
Joseph, I'll let you start.
Yeah, well, this is a challenge, and I don't know, some of the particular situations that that may exist around this issue as it's coming up, but I know that one of the things that we have to be sensitive to and careful about is, those conversations that we might have that really speak to what kids' experience is at home. And so, if we have our learners in homes with situations that would be less than ideal, in the eyes of the Church, how do we approach those situations pastorally and sensitively and help kids learn what is God's plan for marriage and for relationships, while at the same time not chasing people out the door or turning them away. And I think this is something that we're struggling with really as a church very much right now, and I can hear that struggle in Pope Francis' work on the Synod on the Family that is going to resume again this fall, and I think that as a church we're going to find those answers together as part of this conversation. And so I would urge the participant that asked that question to really stay tuned as we continue this discussion, because certainly when we look at the attitude of Jesus Christ, it was one of invitation and welcome. He presented, morality clearly. His teaching is clear, and sin is sin in Jesus' teaching. But Jesus also does that in a way that's pastoral and loving. And I know that can be a challenge sometimes when we're working with families in various situations.
I found the most effective way in working with middle school students in particular around this is to do much what Joseph talked about, is show them the vision, is that God has this gift before us in relationship and the fullness of that, and to present it that way, and also say we're in a journey toward that, and that we're growing toward that. So, in this situation, yes, there is love and there's care, and what are the consequences that are there? And again, not in a judgment kind of way, but to be able to say, on this journey, we're always called to more, to get closer to the fullness of who God made us to be. And in some ways that's kind of abstract, but as you know, so much of the moral situations and how it impacts a learner has to do with their own context and examples that will make sense to them.
And Lori, if I could add one more thing really quick to that question, if we're talking in general about how to help kids understand how God's plan for marriage makes sense, sometimes we'll be supported in that by even the secular research that's out there. The research on living together before marriage indicates that it's not the wise thing to do that some people think that it might be. And the University of Denver research that's done by Dr. Scott Stanley may be a resource for folks that want to be able to show the wisdom of church teaching on this issue.
Thanks. Well, we've gone by quickly through our time, and we really want to thank everyone for being part of today. As I mentioned, there's several resources that are available to help you continue to grow in your understanding and the implementation of this task of moral formation. And particular, as I mentioned, the study that Joseph talked about by Jemnut and Fong, as well as the other resources that are available that Joseph has written. One of the basic things with moral formation, too, is to also give credit to the artists, to those who made things in God's images. So even always acknowledging that can be a way of doing moral formation. So these are some of the images used in this PowerPoint. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kate to bid you farewell, and again, thank you for being part of this webinar. In particular, thank you, Joseph, for being a big part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I appreciate everyone attending today. There is another webinar within the 6 Tasks of Catechesis series that will be hosted on March 12th. We're going to offer that at 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. So we invite you to visit our site to register and learn more about that webinar. There's a series of regional gatherings that will be hosted in mid-March within the Diocese of Springfield, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. We do have information on our website for those gatherings as well. And then, of course, we'll be hosting the MPCD Convocation and NCEA Convention in Orlando, Florida on April 7th through 9th. I'd like to let you all know that registration rates will increase February 25th. So if you were planning on coming and would like to save a few dollars, I would encourage you to register within the next few weeks. And again, you can find all this information on our website at ncea.org. Thank you all for spending your time with us today, and thank you, Lori and Joseph, for all that you have shared. As a reminder, we will be sending you this recorded webinar and presentation slides in another day or two by email. Thank you all again, and may you enjoy a great evening.